Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko, and I'm in Ohio.
Yeah. And so today one thing I'll start off with is May 24th is the 34th anniversary of the bombing of Judi Bari, Earth Firster, environmental and labor organizer and activist in Oakland, California. We're going to get into a bit about Judy, but for that, today we are joined by Karen Pickett, who is a friend of Judy's, but is also a longtime Earth Firster and environmental organizer. She's the founder and director of the Bay Area Coalition for Headwaters, who also has worked with Biocentric Media and many other organizations, including the Ecology Center here in Berkeley, which I didn't find out until recently. Karen, welcome to Green and Red Podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. And maybe we can just start off with a little bit, maybe just tell us about yourself a little bit and how you got involved with environmental work and Earth First, and then what led you to some of these campaigns that we saw in the 80s and 90s and even today.
It was a long time ago that I first got involved. So I guess I have somewhere over 40 years in the grassroots environmental and social justice movement at this point. So I got involved in the 70s, and actually that's when I first started working for the Ecology Center and come to California from East Coast, and I was looking for my place and my path. I thought initially that I was going to move up into the mountains and live with wood heat and without electricity as one of those back to the landers. And I actually did do part of that on the outskirts of the Bay Area, but there was so much going on in the Bay Area that it kept me here. And I was involved with a lot of different environmental issues. And then in the early 80s, I, by happenstance, ran into Earth First. And that was a pretty big corner that I turned in my life, because I hadn't heard about Earth First. It was really in its infancy then. It was just a tiny little organization of a handful of people. And it was just as I was looking for my place in my larger life, I was at that point, I was looking for my place in the environmental movement, because I was affiliated with a number of different organizations, but they didn't quite fit perfectly. And so when I ran into Earth First, it was actually, I read this article that had been written by Dave Foreman, actually, in the Progressive magazine. And it was explaining why these people were moved to form a new organization, because the people who were the founders of Earth First were all involved in mainstream environmental organizations. And in explaining why there was a need for a new environmental organization, the complaint was that all of the DC-based mainstream groups were all about compromise. That's why they were in Washington, DC, because they came up with the compromise that then Congress could pick up on. And the feeling amongst a small group of people was that way too many compromises had already happened. But part of the heart of this written piece as well was an explanation of biocentrism. And sounds corny, but I had an epiphany when I read that, because I realized that this is my place, but this is my philosophy and, in fact, spiritual belief. And I hadn't had a name for it, and I had never discussed approaching things in that way. So that's when I jumped into Earth First with both feet, and that was in the early 80s. And it's really been my principal affiliation since then. And because there were direct action campaigns in areas, not just forest areas, also mining sites and that sort of thing, but In the West, it was mostly looking at the situation of overlogging in the Pacific Northwest. So that's where my energy and interest migrated to. And then when I later formed Bay Area Coalition for Headwaters and got involved in the Headwaters Forest Campaign, that was path that I chose, is to work on these issues, not necessarily in my neighborhood, although there have been some, but primarily forest on the north coast of California and elsewhere. There have been big campaigns like the Cove Mallard campaign in Idaho that went on for years, and I was pretty involved with that. Here I am still doing it.
And with Judy Berry, Judy got involved in Earth First also around the same kind of period, maybe a little bit later in the later 80s. And she's very much known as making alliances between environmentalists and labor, and also reaching out to mill workers and loggers around the issue of the redwoods. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Judy and some of her work, just to lay it out for what we'll also be talking about a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, I met Judy. She had just run into Earth First herself, and it was in the late 80s. It was 1988, actually. And she was excited by Earth First because of the boldness of the organization, because of the no compromise stance and focus on direct action, and also the biocentrism, which was a different spin. And she hadn't really been involved in environmental issues prior to that, although she had been involved in labor issues, as you say. She organized several strikes with the grocery workers, with the postal workers, some of that work before she moved to California, and was also involved with the solidarity movement for Nicaragua. And she had run into Earth First people and the campaigns at the Mendocino Environmental Center, which is not just an environmental center, but a community hub. But she fast-tracked her involvement. She got very involved right away. And it may have been partly because the Headwaters Forest Campaign was just barely starting at that time. We had discovered the Headwaters Grove, which was the largest chunk of untouched old growth redwoods in the forest, in these 200,000 acres owned by Pacific Lumber. And so we were in the stages where we were figuring out what strategy we could take. There had just been some major changes in the ownership of that forest, in that the corporate raider Charles Hurwitz from Maxam Corporation came in from Texas and carried out a hostile takeover of Pacific Lumber that had been for 100 years a family-owned and run corporation that, as timber companies go, was operating pretty sustainably. They did select cuts, they didn't clear cut, etc. I think it looked on the horizon like it could be turn into a fairly large and exciting campaign. At least I would speculate that's one of the things that Judy saw. And also it was a pretty rowdy, fun group of people, Earth Firsters in Northern California, and that fit Judy's bill, I think, because she was a musician, and using music in one's activism really appealed to her. And she's also one of the funniest people that I've ever met, even in the face of dire circumstances. And that kind of fit in with the group of people that she ran into. Got pretty involved in the forest campaign right away. And one of the things that she saw immediately, because of her labor background and because of her not so much her background and the work she had done, but her analysis. And what she saw was a non-unionized workforce of all of the timber companies in Northern California. And essentially an environmental movement that had righteous goals and was developing some pretty good strategies, was not really focused enough on the corporations. And it was the people logging the forest out there were the enemy. People didn't really think about it that simplistically, but often that's what it got boiled down to. And there was a lot of animosity between the timber workers and the environmentalists, of course, helped along by the propaganda that the timber industry was putting out and creating this dichotomy of jobs versus the environment. And they convinced the timber workers that's what was going on here. And so Judy thought that she had something to contribute, and she certainly did have something to contribute, which was her analysis. And so she really caused a major shift in Earth First and other parts of the environmental movement in general. And also part of her analysis was looking at, her background was she was very well read and spoken about issues of socialism, and I think at one point she considered herself a Marxist, but then the analysis that she started talking about was the fact that that analysis leaves a lot out, because Marx would have the spoils of the destruction of the earth divided equitably amongst the people. And the notion that all profit derives from labor, not even the other side, or the other part of that is that all profit, yes, derives from labor and also from the earth's resources. And so she was challenging the socialists who were in her political circles as well. But it was something that she brought to Earth First that, as I said, really caused a major shift and caused changes in Earth First. It attracted people to Earth First, but it also sent people away. But that's what evolution is, right? It's constant change.
I don't know if Bob has a question. Or my other question is, you're talking about her bringing this analysis, which I've seen in some places called class struggle environmentalism, to Earth First. But then she was also applying that to her sort of reaching out and organizing with workers on the other side. And I'm wondering how that was received. And part of the story that's told is that the power holders, the corporate power holders, really didn't like that. And that's partially why there was such a fierce backlash against Judy and Earth First at the time.
Yes, that's the feeling. Without the benefit of having the bombing case solved so that we know who planted the bomb in Judy's car, we can only speculate the motivations behind it. But it's at the same time, I think that things are pretty clear in terms of why she was posing a threat, because it wasn't just espousing this philosophy. Within the activist movement, she was doing workshops on a regular basis so that when people went out in the woods, what she was doing the workshops about was how to talk to a logger. And it sounds very simple, but it's not. It's a different language. It's a different culture. And it's easy when people are going out to save the trees to see somebody with a huge chainsaw with a 2.5 foot long bar cutting down an old growth tree, to see that person as the enemy. And that ends up in confrontation. It ends up in violence, and it doesn't end up with an effective campaign that really challenges the whole operation. She was teaching these workshops within the activist community, but then she was also organizing a local of IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and it ended up being called IWW Earth First Local #1, and it was on the coast. And initially she organized it. She was working as a carpenter when she first got involved in Earth First and in her early days. And she formed this local with another friend who was a childcare worker, and just to get it off the ground, to have some people. And then she started seeking out conversations with both loggers and mill workers, and she seemed to get more of an ear with the mill workers. And particularly after she took some action, there was a Georgia Pacific mill on the coast in the Fort Bragg area. And as I said, these workforces were non-unionized, so they had pretty crappy working conditions. And in the mill in Fort Bragg, there was a PCB spill, and it was in this transformer thing in the ceiling, and basically it sprayed all these workers with this toxic chemical. And the company wasn't doing anything about it, and they downplayed it and basically told people, go home and take a shower and you'll be fine. And so Judy found out about this and went and talked to some of the workers on the side, and she ended up working with the mill workers, filing a Cal OSHA complaint on their behalf, and it was successful. So that went a long way to establishing her intent with the workers, and it was on behalf of the mill workers, but everybody was watching. So at that point, she had a greater audience and was then able to talk to the loggers. But it was because there were these environmental campaigns going on, and because the workers, whether they were in the mills or in the woods, had been fed this line of bull about the fact that it's all these out of town enviros up here raising a ruckus and trying to take your jobs away. And we know you have families to feed, blah, blah, blah. The conversations were not easy to start. They were not easy to pursue in any way, particularly because the entire economy in Mendocino and Humboldt County was based on the timber industry. That's not so true now, and more of it is based on the marijuana industry, and it's diversified somewhat, and there are more tourism dollars as well, because the timber industry is dying because they freaking cut everything. But at that point, coming into the 1990s, most of the populations in these small towns were dependent on their jobs in the timber industry, even though they were not good paying, even though people got killed, people got injured, they had a shorter life working this kind of job. It was simply the reality. So it was very slow, it was very behind the scenes, but she was being successful. And it's interesting to think about, who knows where it would have gone had she not been bombed, because that not only did it blow apart her pelvis, it blew apart these efforts to talk to people on the other side, as it were, because immediately Judy and Earth First in general were portrayed as bombers.
As you reached out to mill workers and loggers, how did the companies respond, the bosses? We have some idea of that, but what kind of feedback were you getting from them? Were they trying to create a division between the environment and labor, or using more kind of coercive measures? What did they do?
They were creating divisions simply to undermine the campaigns before and after Judy got involved. And I think that most of her work was on the down low, and she was pretty successful in keeping it under the radar. And it's why it was so slow, because if there were people involved in these conversations that couldn't be trusted and were going to go tell their bosses, then that would have also scuttled a lot of the work. But it seemed very few people knew that was going on. And then we were in a whole different ballgame after the bombing. So the arguments were still being made, but some of their propaganda about the fact that fundamental issues as jobs versus the environment it all was stepped up as we got into the 90s and after the bombing. So yes, it was less effective because their propaganda was very effective. And they even brought in the big PR firms like Hill and Knowlton and got to the stage where they were, this is like further along after the bombing, but during Redwood Summer, when they were really trying to stop Redwood Summer in 1990, they were writing phony press releases that had Earth First up at the top and saying things like, we're going to come up and wreak havoc in the woods and we're going to have a good old time. And they would distribute those press releases, not to the media, but they would distribute them in laundromats around these rural counties. And of course, they also did the media. So their propaganda campaign was very much stepped up.
Go ahead, Bob.
Earth First gets started, you said one of the main reasons because you saw too much compromise, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. How did other environmental groups respond to what you were doing in Northern California, the kind of more mainstream ones, more kind of the compromisers?
It was a mixed bag, as with every issue. And the Headwaters campaign itself went on for 20 years, and it started out and remained very grassroots. And in fact, when it started out, it was essentially Earth First, carrying out direct action, and EPIC, the Environmental Protection Information Center, which is based up in Humboldt County, which is a group that does litigation on environmental issues, mostly forest issues, mostly forest and species issues, and is a pretty small organization. It was these two organizations, and then we grew an actual coalition, but the other groups in our coalition were the grassroots groups that were on the North Coast. And we had allies like IWW. And there were, I would say that there were representatives from some mainstream groups. There was a woman who was part of our Headwaters Coalition who was very active and very valuable, knew forest law in and out. But she was there on behalf of the Sierra Club chapter. We did not have Sierra Club National, nor did we have Friends of the Earth or these other groups. But some of the people involved in those organizations saw what was happening and were supportive in ways that they could be. And when asked their opinion by the media, sometimes they were so afraid of the direct action, which was not as widespread as it is today. That makes a difference, is that it was seen as extremist, not only by our enemies and opponents, but by some of our potential allies. And so they would either dismiss the work as ineffective or somehow try and say they're intended and they're doing their part, but this is what we're doing. There were some exceptions. There are things that we couldn't say then that we can say now, because some of the bigger groups that did help did not want it public at the time. But for example, Greenpeace was very supportive, and they gave us gear. They helped us raise money. They were great. And we met with them regularly, and they figured out where to put it in their budget so that it all came out clean in the wash. And of course, Rainforest Action Network as well was supportive. And
Try not to be compromisers too much.
yeah, yeah. And there's people like Rand that that dare to say these things in public, but at the time there were damn few that would even give verbal support.
One question I have, because I think it's an important thing for you to give us a little bit of a background and context on leading up to what happens on May 24th in 1990 is Redwood Summer. And Redwood Summer is this, it's going to be a mass action in the forest. It's playing off of Mississippi Summer from the mid 60s, but it's going to be this sort of campaign, the summer of mass civil disobedience. It's what Judi and Darryl Cherney were going around to promote when the bomb went off. But could you just give us a little bit more background on Redwood Summer?
Yeah, and it was essentially Judy's brainchild. She says that somebody brought the seed of the idea to her, but once it came out of her brain, it was much more fully developed. And we quickly shifted from, it was originally called Mississippi Summer in the California Redwoods, but that using that name took too much explaining to avoid people feeling like we were co-opting the civil rights movement. And in fact, it was a discussion as part of our mini strategy discussions on how we would start it and how we would organize for it and how we would get people there. It was that example that was brought up, and with respect to the civil rights movement, looking at Mississippi Summer, the fact that all of these atrocities being the result of racism in the South were going on basically invisible to so much of the country. The media wasn't picking up on it. People were ignoring it. And so people in the civil rights movement hit on this idea that a way to make it more visible was to organize the college students to go down there for the summer. And it worked. It wasn't the be all and end all, but the fact that there were white college students down there in Mississippi and other southern states shining the light on what was going on down there did work for people trying to make these changes. And we felt like the ancient redwoods were falling and nobody was watching. And of course, this was in the days before internet and all of that. We didn't so much have our own media, and certainly the media was ignoring it. And we live in capitalism, and most of the media is corporate media. And so it's clear why that was happening. But because the logging that was really liquidation logging had been increased so much over the previous several years, and then when Maxam came in, immediately after they took over Pacific Lumber, virtually overnight, they nearly tripled the cut and went from select cuts to clear cuts. So to say that it was happening fast is an understatement. And what people were afraid of was that it would be over and our arguments would be moot before we could get into court, before we could win the hearts and minds of the public. So that's why we picked up on that strategy. And I thought it was a brilliant one. And the organizing was done on college campuses around the country. And just before the bombing happened, we had what was a seminal meeting in Berkeley at the Seeds of Peace House that was laying out the strategy for the summer. And Judi and Darryl were there. They were on their way down to Santa Cruz to do a roadshow gig to organize the students there. And the other principal organizers were there at that house in that meeting. And we made plans for these 4 big actions in the course of the summer, and we're just about to launch into it on May 23rd, 1990.
And so May 24th is when the bombing happens. Could you give us a little bit of background detail on that?
It was at about noon. And of course, I had been with Judi and Darryl the night before, and Judy and I had made plans that we were going to get together on her way back up north right after Santa Cruz. And they were on their way out of Oakland. And because the bomb that had been placed in Judy's car underneath the driver's seat was set up with a timer and a motion device. So there was a timer. We got to see the pieces after the fact when we finally got access to the evidence a year later. But there was a timepiece, and then when the timepiece was up, I never knew how these bombs worked, but it's really pretty simple. And then it released this ball bearing that went down and triggered the explosion, and the pipe that was underneath her seat. And it was a bomb that was meant to kill. And the only reason it didn't kill Judy was because it blew the pipe cap off. It was this piece of pipe with caps at either end, and it's supposed to just blow up from the pipe, and some of the force went out the side, so it blew out that part of the car. And so it was less than 100% of the force that went up, but it was a hell of a lot of force, and it impaled Judy on her car seat and basically pulverized her pelvis and injured her otherwise. And remarkably, Darryl, who was sitting in the passenger seat next to her, sustained minor injuries. His eye was injured, but not more severe injuries than that. And so I was actually the first person at the hospital. I got a phone call and at my house, and my roommate called me at work. That's when I was working at the ecology center. And the message was just, Judy and Darryl, the bomb just exploded. They're going to the hospital. And so I just dropped the phone and ran out the door. And later on, crowds converged at the hospital and at the jail because they were holding Darryl after he was treated. But I got there before the crowds, and in fact talked to the Oakland police and the FBI. Didn't know that they were the FBI at the time. They were plainclothes. But initially I thought, they're supposed to be asking questions. A bomb just went off. We were absolutely horrified. We knew there had been a lot of violence going on in the North Coast. There had been violence against protesters. Judy in particular was a target. Just a short time before the bombing, somebody, after she went to the Board of Supervisors meeting calling for eminent domain seizure of Louisiana Pacific lands for the good of the people of Mendocino County, I believe it was the next day, this piece of paper with her image it was a photo taken at the Board of Supervisors meeting with a rifle scope and crosshairs superimposed on her face, and it was hung on the door of the Mendocino Environmental Center. So things had been heating up, and a lot. And one of my thoughts was, is this the culmination of all of that violence? And at the same time, I don't think any of us in Earth First thought that it would go that far, that somebody would try to use lethal force. We didn't feel like we were seen to be that much of a threat. In fact, we didn't feel like we were seen to be enough of a threat because the organizing was so difficult and we were busting butt. But by all appearances, it was Judy's role in this campaign and the kind of organizing that she was doing, and because she was so effective. Judy ended up being in the hospital for 8 weeks. And frankly, even though we just had this meeting and laid out this great plan right after the bombing, I didn't see how we were possibly going to go forward with what we had just planned, because our whole world had changed. And we did, as it turned out, partly at Judy's insistence. As soon as she was able, she started organizing from her hospital bed and said, yeah, get the fuck out there. I'll be there later. Save me a place. but it did go on. It was certainly was tense. Is just a gross understatement. However, I think that it was impossible to say how many people we had coming. We were just trying to plan with Seeds of Peace how we would do the logistics with base camps and feeding people and all that sort of thing. But I think from all appearances, a lot more people came because they heard about the bombing. Of course, it's not something that you would ever stage, although that's one of the things that the FBI said was because they blamed Judy and Darryl for carrying their own bomb. And they said they were going down to Santa Cruz and they were going to stage this bomb explosion that would happen and not hurt them, and to get sympathy, to get attention and to get sympathy, which is absolutely insane, especially for a motion triggered bomb device directly under you. But that's immediately after, within moments of the bombing, within moments of them taking Judy and Darryl away in the ambulance, the FBI and the Oakland police were on the scene. That in itself was bizarre because the FBI is based in San Francisco. And it was like they were there. There were FBI agents there in less time than it would have taken to drive from San Francisco. Our lead attorney in the case, when we ultimately sued them, said it was like they were standing around the corner with their fingers in their ears. And they immediately said, these people are terrorists. We know about these people. Earth first this, Earth first that. And it was their bomb because they must have known that it was in the car. And so they charged them with carrying explosives. They charged Darryl right away, and they held him for a couple days, and we had to raise an astronomical bail. And they charged Judy as soon as she came into consciousness. There was a frigging cop at the corner of her bed.
And with the charges, how long did that legal process play out? Did they eventually drop the charges or never charged? The DA never charged?
Yes. Yeah, the DA did not follow through. It was a couple months. It was well into the summer. And so in the meantime, the fact that didn't stop Redwood Summer is also a miracle because I ended up, instead of going up to Redwood Summer and running around in the woods, well, I was down here for Judy because I was at the hospital every day, but I also had to jump into major media work, essentially doing damage control because of their accusations. They were banner headlines in the paper almost every single day, and would be about the bombers who these people were, and the fact that they had this history, which they didn't have that history, and pretty serious damage control because there was no truth to what they were saying, but the media just ate it up readily. So once the story had been planted, the story got hold, even once the charges were withdrawn. But in any event, Redwood Summer did go on in the rest of the campaigns. But we saw very quickly, too, that this was not just an attack on Earth First. This was COINTELPRO type of tactics.
Right.
And so one of the first press conferences that we had that addressed the charge, addressed what had happened. Of course, we couldn't point the finger at anybody, but we knew it was because of the organizing, and also to challenge the charges. That press conference, we invited representatives from the Black Panthers and the American Indian Movement and a couple of other organizations, but focused on organizations that had suffered COINTELPRO campaigns, and worse than the bombing, because COINTELPRO tactics get lethal, and they did with AIM and they did with the Black Panthers. So it was important to to widen the story and make that point. And that was also just a whole dawning awareness of what had just happened and how we needed to look at it was also a turning point to Earth First, because it was that the beginning of our intersectionality in that part of the environmental movement, maybe because the recognition of our comrades was instantaneous.
But there was a film that came out about 10, 12 years ago called Who Bombed Judy Berry, which kind of tells this whole story. But I'm curious, what does the FBI say now? Judy passed away. Yeah, nothing. Okay.
Yeah,
Judy's family took them to court, and Darryl took them to court, and they won in 2002.
Yes. Yeah. And that court case is so very important, but because it's fairly unprecedented to actually get to a win, because as I'm sure it's so hard to sue the cops, any brand of cops, but especially the FBI. And because they have their qualified immunity, and it's very difficult to break through that. And when the lawsuit was filed in 1991, it had to be filed within a year. It took 12 years to get into court. There were so many challenges by the FBI and OPD for dismissal, and just challenges on all levels. But it prevailed, and then we won, which was amazing, because it was a civil suit. It was about constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, and civil rights of illegal search and seizure and false arrest. But the First Amendment rights violations was about the smear campaign that they conducted against Judy and Darryl and against Earth First. I'm sorry, I lost the thread of what we were talking about before I switched to the lawsuit.
That's what I was wanting to get at, just like how the FBI responded more.
They closed the case, not that long after, and how they responded. When the day of the bombing, when I was at the hospital, they ended up taking me down to the Oakland police station before other people got there, and against my will, I might add. And the one thing I had refused to talk to them, because while initially I said, yeah, you better ask everybody questions and find out what just happened out there on Park Boulevard, they quickly started asking me personal questions. And are you kidding? My friend was just almost killed. And what would it matter? The date I was born. But the one thing that I did say to them was, especially to OPD, I said, look, you guys operate down here. I don't expect that what's been going on in the counties in Northern California. But our campaign up there has been met with increasing violence that has gotten worse and worse. And if this is the culmination of that, then that's where you need to look, and very quickly, before trails get cold. And of course they didn't. They never conducted any kind of investigation. When they closed the case, they had done nothing up to that point except point the finger at Earth First and Judy and Darryl. And we had to, after they closed the case, pretty early on, after a couple of years, we had to fight in court to get the physical evidence, including the car, so that we could file the lawsuit, but also so that we could do our own investigation, because nobody else was going to. And it was a minor miracle that they hadn't destroyed all the evidence. Some of the evidence was destroyed, but we did get a lot of it. And so that's how we were able to build the case. And our investigation we had formed a wobbly bureau of investigation because they were certainly in on it in the early days. But that's one of the reasons why we mark the date and time and location of the bombing every year, is because the bomber's never been found. And somebody out there knows the story.
Right. I've noticed we're getting near the end of our time. And I have one last question. I don't know if Bob has any other questions.
Probably the same one you do.
Yeah, my last question is about Friday, about Judy Berry Day. You just referenced it for a moment. I also didn't know this until recently that the Judy Berry Day was made official by the city of Oakland in maybe 2003.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing.
After we sued them.
Yeah. But what can you tell us about Judy Berry Day on the coming up on this Friday?
It's different every year, and it's an ad hoc thing in a way. And I usually organize it. It's just something that I decided was important to do on a yearly basis since shortly after, some years after the bombing. And so we gather at the spot, which is on Park Boulevard, right outside of Oakland High School. It's at about East 34th Street. It's right after Park Boulevard crosses MacArthur, quite near that intersection. And so that's the spot, and the time is noon. We gather at about 11:30. And sometimes there's a lot of people there. Sometimes there's music. Sometimes there's street murals. Sometimes there's just a handful of people. And it's a speak out, because it's a forum for people to talk about related or unrelated issues that are on their mind. And I always see it as a memory against forgetting, because we're bombarded constantly by things happening, and one event will just sweep away what just happened. And I think it's important to hold on to some threads, and to not so much, it's not a memorial for Judy. It honors Judy, but for what she brought to the movement. But it's more about how we stand up to that kind of repression and police powers and the corporations completely destroying the planet, and how we fight back.
And I saw in the piece you've been sending around advertising it is how Judy stood up to imperialism in Nicaragua, and the event will also be standing with people in Gaza and Palestine.
Yes. There's always parallels to draw if you look for them, that can help us remember how strong we can be and how bold we can be, even in the face of what we're facing every single day.
I'm going to wrap it on that, because I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank you for joining us today, Karen. Very honored to have you talk about this today. And also thank you for all the work you've done over the last 40 years.
Thank you, Scott and Bob. And I hope to see people on Friday. Come on out.
Yep. Folks, you've been listening to Karen Pickett with Earth First, talking about Judy Berry and Judy Berry Day. If you like and we'll share in the show notes information about that if you're in the Bay Area. We'll share it on our social media. And also, if you like what you're hearing on Green and Red Podcast, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit subscribe on YouTube. Or if you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Well, I was driving out of Oakland on a tour for Redwood Summer when a bomb went off inside my car. It was a major bummer. They blamed me for the bomb that almost took my life. But there's one last thing that they did, one last twist of the knife. The F.B.I. stole my fiddle. They stole my fiddle. The F.B.I. stole my fiddle. The F.B.I. stole Sing along. The F.B.I. stole my fiddle. And I want my fiddle back. The next day in the papers, although it made no sense, was a picture of my fiddle, and they called it evidence. stop. They took away my car. But when they took my fiddle, well, you know they went too far. The FBI stole my fiddle.
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 William Sessions stole my fiddle. And I want my fiddle back. They said my strings was fuses. My bow, it was a light. And down inside my fiddle hole, I stashed my dynamite. So when I stroke my fuse strings with my fiddle bow, you better run for cover, 'cause this fiddle might just blow. The FBI stole my fiddle.
The FBI stole my fiddle.
The FBI stole my fiddle.
Stole my fiddle.
J. Edgar Hoover stole my fiddle. And I want my fiddle back. Well, Special Agent Richard Held is the man behind the show. He helped frame Leonard Peltier and jailed Geronimo. He falsified the evidence. Life sentences, no bail. It's time to get them freed, and let's put Richard Held in jail. The FBI stole my fiddle.
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 Richard Held stole my fiddle.